channel. So if you enjoy it so much, you want to watch it again, it'll be there for you. If you have some folks that wanted to catch it and didn't, it'll be posted up there for you guys as well. So thank you very much for joining us. If I have not met you, I see a lot of familiar names in the chat. Unlike the good old days of Zoom, nobody likes to show their faces anymore, so we're not going to force you to do any of that. But if you do have questions, like I said, we're here to answer them. Today's Zoom is really all about school safety. Some of you may have been with us before when we've done our coffee with a principal and we've hit different topics, including school safety, but today will be all about school safety. So if you do have questions for us, Mrs. Z is managing the chat, so she'll be passing that information on to me. And if you have any questions that you want to ask privately or discreetly, direct those to Mrs. Z because she will see those. And then, like I said, if we get to something that's of interest, questions that you may have, please don't hesitate to be shy. We don't have a huge group, so we can have some discussions on things. Today, we've got a few things that we want to go over. The first is I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the incident that we had last week. I've had the opportunity to talk and email and text and meet with many of you who had different questions along the lines of school preparedness and school safety and next steps and all that kind of stuff. And so I will do my best to share as much of that information as I can. Some of that cannot be shared due to student confidentiality. Some things have to do with sort of technical responses, but I will share as much as I can. And then I will put into context last week's incident with our overall safety planning and preparedness and kind of give you a rundown of what we do to be ready for things like this and what we do to be ready for other potential threats, whether they be from people or the environment or otherwise. We'll talk to you about our next steps in the process. We are doing a lot of proactive preparedness and planning, so we'll share that with you. But let's start off, which is why most of you are probably here, is to find out a little bit about what happened last week. As you guys probably received, you probably got a couple messages from me last week. The first one was during the Yeah, I think you got me there too, Mrs. Z, without that mute. Sorry about that. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about last week, what occurred, what we did, why we did it, and how it fits into our overall plan. So we did have an incident last week in which we had one of our middle school students became emotionally unregulated. Very sad situation. Within that situation, the student did make some threats toward other adults, including some of our school employees. In that threat, there were no students present when this occurred. The student who made the threats did leave campus without permission, and then forcibly tried to re-enter campus. It was around that time when the student was off campus that we did summon police because the attempts to return to campus were pretty violent, for lack of better terms, kicking on the doors, kicking on the gates, those types of things. So we were able to de-escalate the situation in waves, meaning we have staff who is trained in de-escalation techniques, and several of those staff members were able to get the student de-escalated at different times. But it got to a point where that student did forcibly return to campus. It was at that time that we did engage our lockdown drill. And then we had subsequent messages that went out both internally to staff and externally to the school community. One of the big questions that I received from folks is, hey, why did you go into lockdown when there wasn't an active shooting situation or something like that? The reason that we went into lockdown is per our policy, is lockdowns are used for active threats on campus. So those active threats could be somebody with a weapon, but it also could be a student or an adult that is actively threatening on campus, which was the case in this instance. Um, there was a question of, okay, well, we heard you went into lockdown and then you went into secure campus. What was the reason for that? Well, secure campus is a little different than lockdown. In your secure campus, you have individuals that are um, threatening, or there's an issue near campus that is threatening, that we are going into a more secure state so that if we did need to do lockdown. So typically a secure campus would be, say on our school, if there was police activity out in front of the school, or there was something in the area that we were concerned may spill over into campus. So in our instance, we had a lockdown. Once police arrived and got the situation under control, we were able to switch that into our secure campus. Once the police had things under control and were able to help remove the student from campus, is when we lifted that. There was a lot of questions that we had about, okay, what were your after effects? Because I know a lot of your kids probably came home and they were pretty shook up. We had some shake up. Okay, good. Okay, I see some questions in here. I'll answer those in just a second. We had some staff members that were shaken up by it, and we had some students that were shaken up by it, and very understandably so. It's a very scary situation. So Mrs. Z and I that day went into all classes, checked in with all students, gave them some developmentally appropriate explanations as to what occurred. And actually were able to debrief with them and get some feedback from them. And some of that feedback was really informative for us. And one piece of that was super helpful was that we had some feedback from students that weren't necessarily getting the back channel information that we were sending to staff about how the situation was developing. And there was a time when we dropped into active to our lockdown that they were concerned that there was an active shooter or some threat, the most feared school threat happening. And it wasn't a long period of time, but it was certainly too long to be feeling and fearing that. And so that was really helpful to get that information from students. And it will change our reaction as we move forward and our explicitness within these events. Because although you go into lockdown for an active threat on campus, the behaviors are very different and the proactive measures are very different if there's somebody on campus with a gun versus somebody on campus that is acting violently towards property. So that was really, really helpful. The other things that had come out from school community members were, hey, what additional follow-up are we doing? And so just this past Friday, our social worker and our school psychologist went in and checked in with all the middle school students and talked to the middle school students. Because what was interesting but not surprising through this incident is that we did see a lot more outward distress from our middle school students than our elementary students. And they know a lot more. They're exposed to a lot more. And I think that it shouldn't be surprising that that was the reaction, but that was what we saw. And so we pushed in our social worker and our school psychologist, checked in with students, offered supports to students. A handful of students took our social worker and our school psychologist up on that. And then there's a lot of push in informally to nutrition breaks and to lunch breaks and times that students are out in passing. And the good news is we are seeing some outward resiliency in our kids. But we also know that what they show on the outside is always how they're feeling on the inside. So we are going to be using a new software application that we have called Kelvin. The board approved that last year. We received it on a grant. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to send out what they call pulses to our school community. And those pulses give us the opportunity to kind of say to kids, hey, how you doing? And within that context to say, hey, if you need help, press this button and we can come help you. And so that allows the barrier to accessing support to be dropped way down. It's not like they physically have to go somewhere or physically identify out, get on a computer, get on an app, anything like that. So it's a really easy way for them to get the support that they need. And the nice thing about the Kelvin stuff is that goes immediately to our social worker and our school psychologist who can respond. So that's kind of how we've sort of moved through there. There was some questions that we received about our messaging, and I wanted to address that as well. There were parents that said, "Hey, why didn't you call us instead of the email?" Saying, "I don't check my emails. I didn't see the emails right away. Why didn't you call us?" We're part of a larger safety consortium, and ironically, about a week ago, we were having this very discussion. And the discussion was, when you have emergencies at school, how do you communicate with your school families? And the advice from law enforcement was to avoid phone calls. And the reason for avoiding phone calls is they say that what they've seen in instances is phone calls create a lot of panic in that people get a phone call, don't actually hear or listen to the message, and automatically respond to the school. They've also seen that it's harder for people to understand when those calls were made on phone as opposed to an email that comes in. And when the folks get it, they may be not receiving timely or accurate information at the time of an emergency. One piece of feedback that we did get that could alleviate that is the use of text, and I believe that came in a suggestion in the chat. That is something we can consider. One of the challenges that we have with our texting abilities is they limit it to 150 characters. So we've got about 3 lines worth of material to work with. And this particular message did require a little bit more detail. The other piece of information that we got from folks that was really helpful was very early on in the process, there was a lot of rumor mongering going on. There was rumors about BB guns or weapons or injuries or that kind of stuff. And that is to be expected in cases like this, because if people don't know exactly what's happening, oftentimes kids, sometimes adults, fill in the blanks with some of that. And what I was really pleased with our school community as a whole is when that information came out, I was able to get folks that were able to quickly, through less formal channels than the school, sort of put some of those false narratives to rest. And it was my attempt in that second message to make it really clear that this was not a weapon-related incident and there was no injuries tied to this incident. So that kind of gets us through that particular piece. Mrs. Z, is there anything? We're all good? Okay. So the next piece I wanted to get into is how that kind of fits into everything else that we're working on. Our emergency planning. The interesting piece about this is I was kind of taking a look at the conversations we were having and the reactions we were getting from families, and incidents like these can really make us feel unsafe. It can make us feel like, hey, the place that I thought was a safe place for my kids isn't a safe place anymore, and can really be difficult to deal with. I can tell you that our reaction in this particular instance was to make sure it stayed a safe place. And I know some people feel, hey, if you're in a lockdown, that must mean your school's dangerous. No, it means that we're going to take steps that we need to do to make sure nobody gets hurt and to make sure that people stay safe. Could we have not called a lockdown and could kids have still stayed safe? Possibly, but we really don't know it. We were able to make sure that the threat at the time was able to stay distanced from all of our children and our staff until law enforcement came and got it under control. So I was looking back on our kind of safety measures, and it was really interesting because we did a safety survey. Some of you may be familiar with this information, but we did a safety survey towards the end of last year as part of our LCAP process. 96% of our fifth graders and 89% of our seventh graders said that our campus, they feel safe at our campus most or all of the time. Parents, 99% feel that it's a safe place for their kids, and teachers who are there each and every day, they agree or strongly agree that this school is a safe place. So the events from last week don't change that. I would argue that the events from last week actually make us a safer place. Because what it does is it gives us the opportunity in a real world setting to reflect on all the preparedness that we put together. Um, you guys would be amazed at this is I'll hold it up for you. That's our current safety plan right now. Um, it'll put you to sleep and keep you up, depending on if you ever read that safety plan. It is one that addresses almost every threat that could be posed to a school. And it does so through the collaborative lens of state, local, and federal law enforcement, through other school leaders, through local emergency responders. And when we have incidents like this, or when our neighbors have incidents like this, we get together and we talk about it. One of our biggest strengths that we have in school safety right now is it is such, and deservedly so, such a high level profile within school communities that we spend a inordinate amount of time making sure that kids stay safe. And when we have instances like this, it helps us to double down on, okay, this is what we thought was going to happen. This is what we did. How did this line up to what our practice has been? Um, as I mentioned, our safety plan is gigantic, but it is in the process of being updated. We update our safety plan each and every year, and this year we went through a major overhaul. Prior to this instance, Mrs. Z and I spent many a day in Trussell Hall pulling together all the best advice as far as safety planning and tying it locally into our stuff. That particular plan is going to be presented at School Site Council coming up. We have a School Site Council meeting, I believe, the 1st of October, Tuesday, 1st of October. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more about that, like I said, I'll go into it tonight, but School Site Council gives a review of that safety plan before it goes to the board. So we'll present that to School Site Council. They'll have a couple months to give input on that. We'll hopefully have an approved plan for this year that we can take to the school board in December. Some people misunderstand the safety planning process, meaning they're like, well, wait a second, if you're taking it for approval, does that mean you don't have a plan? No, we always have a plan. And I can tell you the plan always says draft on it. And the reason it always says draft on it is because we're never done with it. Every time we get an instance, every time there's something that happens, we take a look back at that plan and make sure it's serving the needs that we have. One piece of the plan that you guys will see is, or not see, is about half the plan is considered confidential. And what I mean by that is half the plan has things that are tied to tactical responses. Like you look at our actions that we take before, during, and after emergencies tied to an active shooter situation or a active threat situation. We don't publicize that. Our goal is not to give people with bad intentions the playbook of how we operate, but we do want to bring in good minds from within our school community who want to help and contribute. So there is a balance between when we post this plan publicly, it has about half the stuff connected to it. When we review this privately, we spend the majority of our time on these tactical responses and how we keep our kids safe. So if it is a process that you would want to be part of, let us know, because we make our best decisions as a group. So that being said, I just want to go into a few things that the plan addresses, so you know kind of how it sort of ties into what we went through. A big part of the plan is tied into assessment, and that's tied into risk assessment, threat assessment, including self-harm of individuals. And the bottom line for our school is our location is our best and worst feature when it comes to school safety. And what I mean by that is most schools who have inherent safety problems is typically the area around the school spilling onto the school as opposed to people intentionally coming to do some harm. One of the challenges that we do have, though, is because we're not next to the city, we're not next to first responders, it takes a little bit of time to come out. And so our police, our campus is situated within the city of San Diego. So our police response comes from San Diego. So typically our police response is about 20 minutes. That's a really long time when there is an active incident going on. So it really does emphasize the need for us to have some preparedness and have some skills built within our staff. That being said, we do not have we are not limited in if we were to have an active shooter situation at our school, we're not limited by that response. A couple years ago, probably three now, the safari park did a really informative exercise, and I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to go check it out. And what they did is they had simulated an active shooter situation at the safari park. And what they did that was most informative for me in keeping our community safe is they staged the response times from all the different agencies that came to deal with it. And so the safari park is also San Diego PD, but they were not the first ones to arrive. It was local Escondido, local sheriff that was there, and then they kind of showed how things would work. A big part of our plan is how to respond to the response, and so one of the communication things that we consider is when we do notify folks if there's something out of school, is how are we allowing our responders to come and help individuals without blocking them with our own school stuff, whether it's parents or employees or that kind of stuff. So that was very, very informative. And so we look at our risk assessment, we look at our response time. We have teams that are trained in both threat and suicide assessment. So if there are students that are making threats, we have individuals that are trained to determine whether those threats are substantive threats or they're transient threats. Is this something that they mean and something we have to respond to? Or is it poor choice of words? And so we really need to dig into that because most school tragedies were not surprise incidents. Most school tragedies were ones in which the individual had told people, had acted in ways, had written things down. And so really, really important for us in our school community to make sure that we're identifying those threats appropriately and that we are providing a venue for individuals to report them. So all of you should be aware, all of our kids, at least our middle school students are aware of a program that we have called Say Something. And what that Say Something program is it's a program that was done in the wake of the tragedy at Sandy Hook, the school shooting there. And the parents there got together and said, we need to make sure this never happens again. And so they have a system by which individuals, they can be students or community members, can report any concerns that they have about schools and school safety. And that report goes directly to us, me and Mrs. Z and our counselors at school. It also goes directly to the police. And so if there is an incident that requires immediate action, they get that immediate information. The next piece I want to talk to you about real quickly, and then we'll get to a few questions that came in the chat, is some proactive preparedness. We spend a lot of time working with our local police, local fire. Just the meeting I was in before this meeting, I was over at the Escondido Police and Fire Station meeting with Deputy Chief Sargis to talk about how the fire department serves our school and how we can partner better. About once every quarter, Mrs. Z and I get together with all the other school leaders in Escondido, the superintendents from the high school district and the elementary district, the heads of the charter, the heads of the privates, as well as local police officers, emergency responders, firefighters. And we talk about what's our regional concerns and what's the best strategies for us to address these situations. If you've been at our school, you know that we drill monthly. So we have monthly drills that do everything from lockdowns to secure campuses to evacuations. In the front of the office, I'm sure all of you have seen and experienced. The office is not as easy to get into as it used to. We have buzzer system up in the office that does control the entry, which in this instance was very, very helpful in delaying the attempted return to the campus so that police officers could arrive. So it did what it was supposed to do. We also have film on the doors in the office as well to prevent them from shattering and breaking, again, to prevent access to that. All of our classrooms and learning spaces have lock blocks on them. And what those are is they allow the classrooms to stay in locked positions. So when we had our incident last week, there weren't teachers fumbling around trying to find their keys to lock their doors. There weren't teachers that needed to go outside their classrooms to make sure the door was able to be secured. They just needed to slide the lock block and they were in a secure position. Last summer, we went through and we replaced all the window blinds in our campus. The reason we did that is when we do go into lockdown, we want to maintain a low profile and close our blinds, turn off our lights, stop the learning that's occurring. And we were able to do that with that. We also have 25 cameras on our campus. Super helpful for us in maintaining visibility on all parts of our campus. When we first started this, probably eight to 10 years ago, maybe we started putting cameras out there. We had 4 at the entrances. We've continued to grow so that we have visibility across our campus. And then, like I said earlier, we train our staff to make sure that they're ready for instances that occur. I'm going to check a few questions that came in. Is there a consideration to have volunteer security personnel on campus? We have a version of that right now. Some of you may be familiar with our Watchdogs program. That was a program that was designed for 2 purposes. That program came from our San Francisco School Foundation, and Girl Scout, former student, brought that to us several years ago. And it was brought for 2 purposes. One of them was to get more dads on campus. If you've been to our school, hey, moms are stepping up, dads not always, but as far as our volunteers. So one was to get more dads connected on campus, but the other one was a school safety measure to have additional eyes and ears and patrol and that type of a thing. So we have a version of that. We have talked about making it a more security campus. There's a lot of back and forth between the cost of bringing in security, the challenges of potentially bringing weapons to campus, the pros and the cons of that. So it never got to a point where we've made any commitments to additional security, but that's what the watchdog piece was designed to do. Another question that came in is, do personnel have a weapon in the event of an active shooter? So on that, no, we do not have weapons on campus. There are some strict prohibitions about who can carry them. So typically, if there's a weapon on campus, it's with a trained law enforcement personnel. There was talk, probably still is, about arming teachers and arming school personnel. Law enforcement has a really big problem with the arming of teachers and school personnel who are not trained to do so. Teachers and school people have a different disposition than our law enforcement. And the concerns were that it would be very difficult for a teacher to use a weapon, and understandably so, even if there was a threat on the campus. The other concern that law enforcement has is if they are responding to a weapon on campus, the potential misidentification of the threat could lead to some other challenges. So we do not have weapons on campus, but we do have a lot of parents connected to the school community that are law enforcement that can respond very quickly from the neighborhood. We've had conversations about that. We have, what safety measures are in place for after-school activities such as sports games practices once the gate remains open? Yeah, this is when we talk about campus vulnerabilities. One of them is tied to our school culture. There are some schools that have made the decision for safety reasons to have a closed campus. We have a closed campus within the school day, but we do not have a closed campus before and after school. The general consensus when I've talked to parent groups in the past was that the school culture piece of it, the belongingness, the able to be connected, the access to campus actually makes us safer. because there's more people that are there, more eyes that are there, more people connected to the school. It does create a vulnerability. And if you kind of look at our school at the beginning of the day and you look at our school at the end of the day, there are adults that are out and about, but there's nobody monitoring those gates after school like there is in the morning time. So it is a vulnerability to us. I can tell you that students after school are supervised, but the perimeter of the campus is not. So that's like I said, one of those vulnerability pieces that we look at when we say where are we at with school safety. Um, yeah, this is a question that we get a lot, and I can address this as well. Um, and this question is the student that was at the center of this incident coming back to school? Um, I can tell you two honest answers. One is I can't tell you, and the other is I don't know. But let me give you a little bit more detail on that. The can't tell you piece is tied to student confidentiality as far as if your child was involved in an incident, there's restrictions on what I can say about your child to other people. But here's hopefully this will give you a little idea of kind of how these types of situations play out. There's usually three paths that determine whether a kid can come back. One of them is the school discipline path, and that school discipline path can result in short-term out of school for a suspension, or a long-term out of school for an expulsion. I can tell you that the educational codes and so forth make expulsion much more difficult than it was. There's a push in in education to support students as opposed to pushing them away. And oftentimes the students that come back and do harm to their schools are students that were pushed away from those schools. They weren't able to be supported anymore through that school. And then there's a grievance toward it. So there's some arguments about what that effect is. So there is that particular path. The next one is the legal path. Kids who engage in this are engaging in activities that are not legal. Some of them end up in juvenile hall and places like that, and that does keep them out of school. Depending on the length there, that's where they receive their school. The other path that is typically looked at in cases like this is if the student does have a disability of some sort, there's an IEP path that we look at. And that usually looks at things like what supports does that student need so that that student is safe to themselves and safe to other people. In any of these paths, wherever the student does return, any school is going to put in place a plan, including a safety plan, that is designed to keep the student that was in the middle of this safe and also to keep everybody else safe. And it's a tough balance. It's a tough balance because students have a right to attend school somewhere. And if they lose a right in one place, they're going to go somewhere else, and that somewhere else is also going to put in plans. Our goal in these instances is to identify why the student was acting the way that they were and to put a plan in place or to recommend a plan somewhere else where that student can get the services that they need. So not too sure if there's other questions before we move on. Okay, so there's protocols about question says, what's protocol being taught students who are out in the open during an incident involving a threat? For example, PE or the bathroom transitions to class. Really good question. And it really depends on what the threat is and what the emergency action that's called. So if we were to have a lockdown, like the one that we had, the protocol for that lockdown is to the teachers or whoever's in control of space will look to sweep that area of whoever's there in that space and bring as many kids as they can into their classroom, and that's when they lock it up. The lockdown protocols are such that it's a nobody in, nobody out. So once those teachers secure that space, it's a nobody in, nobody out. There are nuances to it, though. The most important piece, if there was an active shooter incident, is to be able to provide what we call situational awareness to all of our staff. And what that means is that they know what's going on and they know what the threat is and where it is. Because what teachers are taught is that if you look at it in the context, I'm sure most of you have heard of the run, hide, fight model. If you look at it in the context of a school environment, the run piece of that is if you know that where there's just threat and you know a safe path to get away from that threat, that is your first option. So when we kind of look at these things, if we have individuals that are out on the playground, for example, we just installed, and this was based on a campus walk that we did with Escondido Police, is we did a campus walk with Escondido Police and realized that the speaker system that the school has um, isn't clearly heard from the playground area. And so what that told us is that if we had an active incident with students on the playground, they aren't going to hear the information that they need and could very much walk back into a dangerous situation. So part of our planning on the playground is having exits that go out the back. So we have part of our evacuation procedures and part of our paths for our run, hide, fight models take us off campus. One of the big mistakes that was made early on by school personnel during these types of incidents was to go into their normal ducking, cover, and hide models. And while that is something that is useful in some situations, if there's an active threat and there's a place to go to get away from it, that is the first and foremost important piece of that. So I think that helps it. There's a question about the response time. Yeah, so I can tell you, yes, it says response time of 20 minutes. I want to know if Escondido PD would respond even though we are STPD. Yes, that's a frequent topic of conversation within our community group. The community group that I am part of is with the Escondido Police, and it's for that very reason, is that if we did have a threat that was a active shooter or a violent action towards the school, towards school where injuries were occurring or likely to occur, we get a multi-jurisdictional response. And so within that, you would get a combination of your Escondido PD, your sheriffs, your San Diego PD, possibly federal law enforcement. When the incident occurred in Sandy Hook, the first responders to that scene, and I know that my brother was an FBI agent at the time in New York, and he worked with some of the FBI agents in that area. The first responders to Sandy Hook were FBI because they were local to the area. And so law enforcement has the ability to put out these bulletins across jurisdictional agencies to get a multi-jurisdictional response. So we would get a quicker response in that event. In the times that we've called them, including this event, they don't do that multi-jurisdictional response because we had threats and we had out of control behavior, and we were able to get everybody locked and secured, and so they were able to control the situation. So yes, we would get a multi-jurisdictional response from that. Mrs. Z, did I miss any other questions? I see one that just came through.
Yeah, one is about bulletproofed classroom windows.
Yeah, it's definitely a vulnerability. When you look at how our campus is, it's super beautiful and pretty, but it is not secure from if people wanted to shoot through the glass. Without getting too graphic on some of these things, the buildings at schools also are not bulletproof. So the challenge that we have when we sort of look at these situations is that um, the ability to put bulletproof glass in the windows is limited from just a pure finance standpoint. I don't like to put finance when we start talking about safety, but you would literally have to bulletproof every building and probably enclose them in some way. And so it gets back to what sort of school sort of school do we have? You know, one of the kids brought up a question regarding this incident, and that um, the gate was able to be broken with enough force which is when the breach occurred here at our school. And they were like, well, why don't we have 10-foot gates with razor wire on it, and that way nobody will ever get through. I said, yeah, you could. I said you could build a moat around the school too, and nobody could come. But again, it gets back to that question that we had earlier about what sort of school do we want to have and what sort of field do we want to have for our kids. Some schools do have metal detectors that every student goes through every single day. Um, would that make us safer? Probably. Is it a necessary thing for a school like ours? Probably not. And I can tell you, if we had metal detectors at our school and barbed wire on the fence, we wouldn't have 95% of our kids saying that they feel safe at school. So it's a real balance between the two. Question that just came in. What has been done to address kids' trauma in this situation? There are some kids that aren't feeling safe at school anymore. Please let us know in that situation, because we have done a lot of reaching out to students. We've done a lot of observation of students. We've done a lot of encouragement of students to let us know if there are challenges that they're having, because this is traumatic and scary. And depending on a child's previous circumstances, this could bring up some stuff. So if you are finding that your particular children are still struggling with this, please let Mrs. Z or I know. We'll connect them up with a counselor and to support. As I said earlier, we will be doing touch points in and checking out with kids and seeing. But one of the greatest strengths that we have in our school community is relations and connections. And even though it's early in the school year, our teachers and staff are very well connected to your kids. Our duty aides on the playground interact with them. The teachers interact with them. The PE teachers, the music teachers, the counselors. There's a lot of people available. But if your child is finding it hard to get through that threshold piece and asking for that help, and you know that they need it, please let us know. Please let us know. Want to know when that's going out to folks. Um, Good chance it's going out probably by the end of next week on the touch point survey. We thought we were going to be able to do it this past week, but it does require some back end data entry. And when that data entry was done, it didn't sync properly. So we're looking to get that done. It could be sooner, but I would think by the end of next week, we'd have that going out. The current plan is to send it out to our middle school students. We're getting very little feedback from elementary that students are struggling. And one of the challenges that we have, and we've had this discussion back and forth, is how do we best serve the needs of our kids without perseverating on something that they're moving through? Because I know Mrs. Z and I said to them both in the classrooms, and I said it to them when we had our assembly the next day. Yeah, that was scary, and everybody was scared. But we made these decisions so that we could be safe, and now we can. Now we know that the plans that we put in place can keep us safe, and so that's the message that we want to kind of move forward with. But we don't want to create fear as students sort of work through some what I would say are normal emotions to a traumatic situation. But like I said, if your child's responding in a different way, that's normal too. And so let us know. There's a reason that we have a full-time social worker and a full-time school psychologist. And right now we have a social worker intern. We have a lot of people that are trained in that. So we'd love to talk to you about that. And that was about the survey. Any other questions, Mrs. Z, at the moment?
I think you captured them all. I'll keep looking through the chat.
Okay. I'm just going to briefly review some of the components of the safety plan, just so you guys know some of the things that are on our mind. The safety plan does include a combination of tactical responses and emergency responses. And so we have specific planning in place, specific plans in place on what we do before, during, and after certain incidents. And they include things like an intruder on campus. And I was really pleased that when our team went back and took a look at, okay, what's the playbook? The team did a really good job and was ready. for that instance. We have a similar playbook on if there is a weapon on campus, or if there's a bomb threat, or earthquakes, or fires, whether they're structural or wildfires. We've met with CAL FIRE to talk about exit routes and what's the best thing for us to do if those things happen. We have plans in place when the lights go out, and we have plans in place when the air quality is not so good. But all those plans are kind of tied towards emergency responses, and we talked a little bit about those. And we talked a little bit about the difference between a lockdown and a secure campus. The lockdown is one where everybody's in their rooms, no in, no out. The learning does stop during that time. Lights go out. We ask students to be placed in protective places within the room, and that again will be situational awareness. It does differ from secure campus, and when we switched from our lockdown to secure campus, we wanted everybody to stay inside the class because that was the safest place for them to be. But we weren't worried about during a secure campus something coming to them and being threatening. And so we do have instruction can continue, and within those building activities can continue during secure campus. That does differ from a shelter in place. So we also have a shelter in place. So if you ever hear us calling a shelter in place, that's typically because there's something in the air or in the environment that is dangerous. And in our case, probably smoke. So if we had an incident where there was a wildfire and the smoke was causing air quality to be bad, we'd probably go into a shelter in place. And what happens in those is we want the kids to stay inside, but you don't need to lock the doors because there's nothing coming to get you per se. But you do close the doors. We seal off the doors. We turn off the vents of the air conditioner so that whatever is outside stays outside from an environmental standpoint. We still do the duck cover and hold on drills. So if you're old like me, you probably remember doing them when you were a kid, even though I grew up in New Jersey and there was never an earthquake ever in New Jersey, but we still did those drills. We have that duck cover and hold on drill coming up in October. And then we also practice both off and on-site evacuations. So we've already done a drill where we've evacuated to the lower playground, which is evacuations are essentially saying, hey, there's something about the building you're in that's not safe. We're going to move you to another place. And if we were in an instance where there was something about the campus not being safe, we have offsite evacuations. We have plans to evacuate in towards the community and staging kind of where the golf course is. We have plans to evacuate outside the back of the playground into the cow farm. We have a vehicle transport plan, takes us over to whatever they're calling the mall now. I think it's North County Mall now again, but those types of things. So there are a number of plans in place that if we had to be somewhere else, we've got some plans to do that. The safety plan also goes over some more boring, I guess, but not unimportant things that have to do with protection and prevention. So like within our safety plan, it talks about our child abuse reporting and our safe routes to school and our bully prevention and how we handle school discipline and our trauma-informed care practices and our restorative practices. So there's a lot of those pieces in there that aren't your emergency response, but they're those proactive measures to prevent, in many cases, bad things from happening. So I know I've been doing a lot of talking. Are there questions that have come up that we haven't got to, or any that you guys would want to ask before I kind of go into what some of our next steps look like? All right, I'll briefly go into them. So as I mentioned to you guys, we are in the process of a major overhaul to our safety plan. Where we are right now is we've taken the latest, greatest advice. We've taken all of our previous safety planning that we've done and incorporated within that plan. And then we're going to have some discussions. So the first discussion that we're going to have is at our school site council meeting, October 1st. And within that school site council meeting, we're going to talk about some of these concerns as far as what are these vulnerabilities and are there some things from a community perspective that we can do that we're not doing. There's a lot of options for how we do school safety, and I'm very proud of the school's efforts to be really proactive on a lot of these measures. But are we missing something? And so we'll have that conversation. We'll be training with our staff that second week of October. We have a staff meeting that's dedicated completely to school safety. And within our staff members, we do tabletop exercises, and we look at what are some potential things that could happen and how we keep our kids safe from that. This will be a board discussion in December as well as the board takes a look at it. Parallel to these plans, and this will also go through the same path of school site council and into the board, is we're also looking at our wellness plans. Because a lot of these instances really get ourselves to be tunnel vision on these worst case scenarios, and we want to be ready for them. But the real case scenarios that are happening are our kids well? Are they eating healthy? Are they getting enough exercise? Are we teaching them lessons at school that are teaching them to live healthy lives? And so it's important for us not to get so fixated on some of the emergency pieces and lose sight of our overall wellness of our kids. So we'll be talking about those two things parallel. They're separate plans, but they are certainly ones that are not distinct. They very much overlap with one another. So you'll hear a lot about our wellness and our safety plans coming up, and then we'll continue to refine and do whatever we can to make sure that the students, staff, and families that come to San Pasquale remain safe. Miss C, you have some? No? Okay. So does anybody have any other questions? If there are some things that do come up, or if you talk to some folks and you have questions, Mrs. Z and I are always available to have discussions on how to make sure that we're staying safe at San Pasquale. So thank you guys for taking an hour out of your night. I know the principal's coffee, sometimes a little easier with some caffeine in you. We'll have one of those in October as well. Hopefully it'll be some other topics in addition to our safety. So I really appreciate you guys and your partnership and your input. Questions are great. These are the things that help us continue to refine. So I really appreciate your time tonight. I hopefully will see most of you tomorrow at school. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to ask them. All right. Thank you guys very much. Have a great night.